The first thing she learned about Berlin was its sound. It wasn't the roar of artillery or the angry crackle of small arms fire, though those never stopped, but the low, exhausted groan of a dying city, glass grinding under boots, doors moaning on broken hinges, distant walls collapsing with the sigh of old lungs. It filled the corridors of the factory that had become a hospital. It seeped into the linen. It rattled the enamel trays. It got into the bones. Nurse Anya Morozova tied off a vein with the last good length of tubing and watched the blood climb toward the bottle like a dark animal finding its way home. The man on the cot sucked in air through broken teeth. His left sleeve was pinned where an arm used to be. The bandage at his stump was clean for now. In an hour it would not be. She tucked the blanket under his shoulder, touched his cheek with 2 fingers and moved on. Next, she said, even though there was no next. There was only the corridor, full of men and boys and the color that all uniforms became when bled into enough. That universal rusty brown. The triage station was an assembly line made from doors laid across crates, the doors still carrying bits of wallpaper that looked obscene in this place. Cabbage roses, pale blue vines, golden stripes. On the first door, Corporal Sidorov examined wounds with a flashlight that flickered when the generator coughed. On the second, Anya started lines, cut away cloth, sponged blood. On the third, a doctor who had once been a pediatrician in Kazan placed tags around necks, green if they would live, yellow if they might, red if they wouldn't without a surgeon, black if they wouldn't no matter what anyone did. The tags were cardboard rectangles that got soft in the damp. They were stamped with boxes for time and pulse and procedure. They looked like the labels on sacks of flour. "Comrade nurse." The voice came from the loading bay, where the brick wall was missing and the April air pushed in with its cold, damp hand. A sergeant stood at the top of the ramp, cap tilted, greatcoat filthy to the knees. Behind him, 2 prisoners hunched beneath the barrels of Soviet rifles. "New batch. Mixed. Yours?" "Ours," she thought, and hated how the word worked in her mouth. "Put them there," she said, pointing to the empty stretch of floor that had once held machine parts. They were Germans and Volkssturm boys, and one man in a suit jacket with a red armband that had not helped him. There were 2 civilians with dust-scraped faces and wrists bound loosely with string, their eyes huge in the fluorescent half-light. There was a Soviet private whose tunic had been exchanged for a coat with a bullet hole and whose eyes wouldn't meet theirs. She and Sidorov went to work without looking at faces. Their hands made their own decisions. Cut the belt, lift the shoulder, find the wound, find the vein, count the breath. The doctor bent and straightened like a man in a wheat field. "Keep the prisoners separate," the sergeant said. "NKVD will be by." "Then they will find who they need," Anya said, because the words did not cost her and defiance would. A shell fell somewhere close. The factory bones shook. Plaster dust settled into her hair. The bulb swung. A pulse that had been 100 became 120. She wrote the numbers in the little box. Her pencil left a groove from pressing too hard. The 4th prisoner in the line was an older man with gray in his beard and mud on his collar. He had a folded paper stuffed into his breast pocket that he kept trying to press into Sidorov's hand. Sidorov waved it off. The man's German came out in a dry rattle. He said "Fahrer" twice, and something like "Wasser." Anya gave him a cup. He drank and cried in a small, private way that required no comfort. Behind him, a teenager whose helmet sat too big on his skull stared at her. His knees shook. There was a charred blister across his cheek in the shape of a hand. The hand that had tried to save him was still there, imprinted by heat. And then there was the 6th. He stood with the others, but he did not look like them. Not because of uniform, his was the same field gray faded to ash, but because of how he held himself. Not proud, not broken. As if he were listening to a sound only he could hear. He kept his eyes on the floor until she touched his sleeve. Then he looked up. Memory is a trickster, Anya knew. It lays traps. It changes a jawline, smooths a forehead, crops out entire wars. But some faces were cut so deep into the mind that even the dust of Berlin could not bury them. 4 years vanished and came roaring back in the same breath. The summer of 1941, the road outside Vyazma, the ditch that smelled of weeds and metal and fear. The squad of Wehrmacht men with cigarettes hanging from their lips. The lieutenant who checked papers, the crack of a rifle, the way the air was clear and the noise was bright because death hadn't learned how to be muffled yet. She had been 20 then, with hair like wheat and hands unscarred by lye and iodine. She had hidden behind a hay cart while her father shouted in a voice she had never heard in their kitchen. The lieutenant had turned his head at the shout. He had seen her. He had measured something in what he saw and had said in Russian with a schoolbook accent, "Go. Run." He had turned to a corporal and ordered the truck to be moved. There had been a space. She had run. The face in front of her had lines where there had been none, and a scar at the corner of the mouth that hadn't been there, and eyes that had learned to keep their secrets. But all faces weathered toward who they were. She knew him. She had to hold the edge of the door to keep from sitting down. He did not seem to know her. Why would he? She had been a frightened smudge in the background of his war. She had been one decision among hundreds. He might not even remember the road, the cart, the girl. He looked at her and then past her, toward the gurneys, toward the lights. His lips were blue. His breath whistled in a chest bound with a field dressing. Blood had soaked through in the oval that always meant lung. She reached for the dressing with a hand that would not stop shaking. Sidorov touched her elbow. "You all right, Anna?" "I'm fine," she said. Her mouth made the word. Her throat did not believe it. She lifted the edge of the cloth. A pink, sticky hiss greeted her. "Left hemothorax," the doctor said from the next table without looking. "Yellow tag to Bay 2. If he drops, red." The cardboard tags lay in a metal tray like biscuits. Anya picked up yellow without thinking, then glanced toward the loading bay. A shadow filled the doorway. A greatcoat with black tabs. NKVD. Captain Krug stepped into the light as if it owed him money. He had the clipboard that made him the most dangerous man in the building. He smelled faintly of cologne and much more strongly of boiled wool. He did not look at the wounded at first. He looked at the tags. "Where are the prisoners?" he asked. "Here," the sergeant said, because that answer always meant here. Krug walked the line and stopped at the 6th. He read the name tape, though it was mostly smoke and thread. He touched the man's dressing with 2 fingers and then wiped those fingers on the man's sleeve. He turned to the doctor. "Priority of care?" The doctor, Zoran with the pediatrician's hands that had learned new tricks, kept his voice on the lower shelf. "Soviet wounded first, Captain. Prisoners after. Civilians if they are critical." "And this one?" "Yellow. Could be stabilized. We'll need a tube and a surgeon." Krug looked bored, which was worse than angry. "You will stabilize him enough to speak. Intelligence wants names. If he lives, he will be transferred." "To where?" Sidorov muttered. "A hole?" Krug's eyes cut toward him like a bayonet. "What did you say, Corporal?" "Nothing, Comrade Captain." Krug smiled with the half of his mouth that still remembered how. "Good. Doctor, be quick." He stepped away toward the boy with the blister hand burned into his cheek. He looked at the boy as if he were a lamp that had run out of paraffin. He made a mark on his clipboard. He did not look at Anya. Anya looked at the tray of tags. Yellow, red, green, black. They were things that should have been simple. They were not. The lieutenant, if he was a lieutenant now, if he had ever been, watched her hand. He tried to speak. The German had drained out of his mouth with his blood. What came out was Russian, as careful as a man walking on a mined road. "Water," he said. She lifted the cup. He drank, and when he lowered it, he whispered, "Spasibo." No German says the Russian thank you as if it were part of his own tongue, she thought, unless he has used it before, unless he has said it to himself. She cleaned the wound with iodine until the blood turned orange. He did not flinch. She reached for the catheter tube with the hole she had learned to cut with her thumbnail. She could hear Krug at the far end of the hall asking about a different man. She could hear the city moan. She could hear the door in her head creak back open onto a summer road. She leaned very close as if to check his pupils. In a whisper as small as a sparrow, she said, "Vyazma." His eyes did not change. His pulse did. It jumped beneath her fingers like a fish. He looked at her as if a window had opened in a burning room. "Run," he said, one word, just that, and she knew he knew. The tube slid into the chest with the wet relief that every nurse felt with her hands before her head. Air rushed. His shoulders lowered. His lips lost their blue a little. She wrote the time in the box. "Morozova," Zoran called. "The amputation on table 3 is bleeding through. Leave him to Patel." "Coming," she said. She raised the yellow tag to loop it over his neck. Krug's shadow slid over the floor again. "Wait," she said too quickly, and the shadow paused. Her hand hovered over the tray. Yellow. Red. A red tag would bring a surgeon sooner. It would keep him here. It would keep him out of Krug's truck long enough for the front to move past and change the map. It would also take a table from one of hers. It would also break the order that kept this place from becoming the street. He had told her to run, and she had. He had used his uniform like a key to open a door for a stranger. He had not shot into a ditch because he had liked the sound of his own authority. He had saved her life at the cost of nothing but risk. She told herself he was a man with a lung and 2 eyes and a pulse. She told herself it was the same. She knew it wasn't. "Morozova," Zoran said, sharper. She didn't know when she made the decision. She only knew that her fingers were sticky and the cardboard felt soft and the pencil marks looked like a cross of their own. She put the red tag around his neck. Krug's boots stopped beside her. "This one?" "Chest wound. Red," she said. Her voice held. Her hand did not. Krug looked at the wound, at the tube, at the numbers in their boxes. He looked at her name tag. He glanced at Zoran, who said nothing because he was smart and because he had once loved children and knew how not to give someone else away. "Be quick," Krug said, bored again, and moved on. She exhaled, and the breath felt like it had been stored since 1941. She turned to go to table 3 and the big stump that was pumping its red knead into cloth, and something tugged lightly at her sleeve. She looked down. His fingers were on the hem, not to hold her, but to steady himself on the fact of her. "Name," he said, the Russian word careful in his mouth. "Anya," she said. "Anya Morozova." He nodded as if that were the answer to a question he had asked years ago on a hot road with a ditch full of weeds. Then he closed his eyes and let the tube do the work. She went to the amputation and pressed where pressing stopped things. She tied and cut and swore and prayed and wiped her forehead with the back of a wrist that tasted of salt and iodine. She changed a dressing on a boy who had a letter to his mother folded in his boot. She fed sugar water to a civilian woman who kept asking about a cat that no one had seen because the city had eaten its cats. She washed the hands of a dead man because someone should and because she could not wash the city. When she looked up again, the NKVD had returned with a stretcher and a question mark. Krug pointed at 3 prisoners. 2 wore yellow, 1 wore black. The black would go nowhere but the far room. The yellow would go into a truck. Anya met Zoran's eyes. He blinked once, slowly. She moved toward the 6th. He watched her with that stillness again, as if only the middle of him were breathing. The red tag hung from his neck like a sentence. She could see the line where her pencil had pressed. "Doctor," Krug said. "How long?" "An hour," Zoran said without looking at anyone. "If we are to try to keep him breathing through the trip, an hour." Krug's jaw worked while his mind chewed. He did not like to wait for anything except obedience. He tapped the clipboard against his thigh and finally nodded. "Hour." He turned away. Anya's fingers found the knot of the tag's string without her permission. She felt the tug of the cardboard against her knuckle. She saw the tray, red, yellow, green, black. She saw the boy with the letter in his boot. She saw the stump. She saw the city. She heard 1941 say, "Run." The string tightened. The knot held. She had bought him 60 minutes. 60 minutes in Berlin was the difference between a building standing and a building on fire. Between a truck here and a truck stranded by a shell crater. Between one man being a prisoner and being a patient. Anya stepped back. "We need ether," she said to Patel, and Patel nodded and already had the bottle because he had decided to believe she knew what she was doing. She pricked his skin and let in a thread of sleep. Zoran bent with his scalpel and the lamplight picked out the silver in his hair that had not been there in Kazan. The chest rose and fell. The city moaned. The tags lay in their tray looking like nothing at all. Outside, 2 more trucks backed up to the ramp. Their engines exhaled blue smoke. The NKVD men lifted their rifles and then lowered them because there was nothing to shoot that would not make their own boots wet. "Morozova," Krug said from the doorway softer. "Do your work. Do not do mine." She did not look up. "Yes, comrade captain." 60 minutes, she thought. She had given him 60 minutes. She would have to steal the rest. Say continue when you want the next part. The hour that would not end. Surgeon and nurse racing the clock. The second visit from Krug with an order she cannot obey. The swap that must happen in plain sight and the price.